Fantastic, excellent, fantastic, good. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Parliamentary Pavilion. It is day 6 here, and national, and delighted to welcome you to a fantastic report launch, which we're going to have. Of course, Finance Day is behind us, and we have seen an absolute report, which has just been launched in the last few days by the Environmental Audit Committee in the UK Parliament, and we have 3 members of Parliament here who are going to tell you all about it. So, welcome the members who are in the audience here and, of course, our online audience. I'd like to hand over directly to you, please, the Right Honourable Philip Dunn, Member of Parliament who chairs the Environment Audit Committee.
Thank you very much, Melina, and it's terrific to have this opportunity to talk to people here at COP28 and those watching on the live stream. This is, I think, the first time that parliamentarians have had a pavilion to be able to speak to each other and to the wider audience at a COP. So we're really great, but really delighted to be able to support the work that Globe International has done in putting this together. So I chair the Environmental Audit Committee, as Melina said. This is the committee that's been in existence in the UK House of Commons for just over 25 years. We celebrated our 25th birthday earlier this year, and it has the role within Parliament of acting as the backbench scrutiny committee for everything to do with the environment touched on by the national government and local governments, and we even reach into the private sector, which is what this latest report is partly about. And our role is to scrutinise government policy, to scrutinise development against, or delivery against that policy, and we do so on an entirely cross-party basis. There are 16 members of our committee. It's one of the 2 largest select committees in the House of Commons, and we are not constrained by following the work of an individual government department. And of course, the environment doesn't respect administrative boundaries. It reaches across all activity, and that gives us the opportunity to roam far and wide across the work of government and beyond, as I've said. So we have a range of activities each year. We currently are undertaking inquiries into a whole host of things, many of which are directly relevant to what are being discussed today. I mean, perhaps most obviously, we're doing an inquiry at the moment into heat resilience and sustainable cooling. We have an inquiry ongoing into the electricity grid capacity in the UK, which is a massive issue as we seek to build so much more new sources of renewable electricity. We have an inquiry launched, but yet to take oral evidence into natural capital, so plugging into the whole biodiversity challenge that we are all facing. And we have other inquiries on sustainable timber, which was published, and we get a government response very shortly, on air quality, on environmental change and food security. So a whole wide range of issues. Actually, in aviation emissions, maritime emissions will be coming out, I hope, before Christmas. So by being a cross-party committee, we reach conclusions almost invariably unanimously through the committee, and that gives us very considerable force when we make recommendations to government, because the power that our committee structure in the UK has is it requires government to give us a response to any recommendations that we make. They're supposed to respond within 60 days. Sometimes they do, sometimes they seek a short extension, but they do respond directly to our recommendations. And by and large, in the UK parliamentary system, select committee recommendations are often find their way into policy in due course. They don't accept, governments of whatever complexion don't accept all recommendations as a rule, but we have quite a good track record within our committee of getting many of our recommendations accepted by governments. And in their responses to our reports, they spell out with reasonable clarity what things they're going to accept, what things they're not going to accept, and then there's a sort of grey area in the middle where they might accept the thrust of what we're saying but not the specific. And I think that happens with all select committees. I think in the Environment Committee, I would say that we have a better track record than others. We conduct our inquiries by taking written evidence, and then we have oral evidence sessions which normally conclude with a minister. So in the case of this report, which we've come to talk about today, this is a report into the financial sector headquartered in the UK and its relationship with the net zero transition. And I'm very pleased to talk about this with members of the committee today. We have Barry Gardner, who's been a long-standing member of the committee and other select committees in Parliament, and is as many of you will know, has been working on the climate issues for most of his parliamentary career. And Claudia Webb joins us also, who's been on the committee for several years. You're both very welcome and will be speaking shortly. So we launched this committee, this inquiry, about 18 months ago in May 22, and the objective was to follow up on the COP26 commitments that had been made through the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was launched in Glasgow in 26. A whole host of commitments were made through that initiative, which was spanning, I think, 8 different subsets of the financial services sector across each of the different industries, and they've made a whole host of pledges about what they would do to make their contributions towards net zero, much of it aligned to the regulatory requirements that the UK government began to introduce, some ahead of COP26, some following, and in particular on the disclosure requirements for climate. So the climate transition disclosure requirements, which financial companies are now obliged to report on. And being followed up by the nature disclosures, which we'll come on to shortly, because we made some recommendations on those. We wrote to most of the signatories of the of GFANZ, as we call it, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, asking them to spell out how they were adjusting their behaviour, and in particular in relation to their reporting requirements, which they now had. We had some nearly 40 responses from UK-based financial, or either UK financial institutions or global financial institutions headquartered in the UK. And we received responses which were generally engaging with our inquiry, and there was quite a wide range of responses which we will touch on about how net zero is impacting their investment policies for fossil fuels. We held 4 oral evidence sessions between October last year and May of this year, and we agreed our written report, which you can take away afterwards. We've got copies at the back. The week before last, and we published it on the 29th of November last week. It had significant pickup within the UK financial press because we came to a number of conclusions, some of which were comfortable for the government, some of which were slightly less comfortable for the British government. I think the headline that I would like to land with this audience is that the UK, as a result of the City of London Financial Centre, prides itself in being one of the leading financial centres around the globe. And in green finance, we properly can take pride in that for the last 4 years in a row, the UK has been number 1 in the Global Green Finance Index, which looks at a whole host of parameters. So independent arbiters of these things recognise that the UK does have very considerable strength and leadership in driving change to promote the net zero agenda within financial institutions. And that's a good thing. The challenge is that many countries and many financial centres around the world are all now engaging on this agenda and are seeking to catch up and compete. And competition in this domain is an extremely good thing, because it's competition which pushes us all to change our behaviour and do the right thing. And in financial services, competition in many areas is global. Obviously, there are some elements of domestic financial services provision at the retail level, which are very highly, well, they're all highly regulated, but are quite highly protected. But by and large, we live in a global financial world, and big institutions that are looking to do big projects wherever they are in the world can seek to raise finance in whatever centre makes most sense for them. So it is a very competitive environment. The UK has been a leader in this domain, and we'll come on to talk now a little bit about some of the conclusions from our report. So the first thing we looked at is to what extent are financial institutions shifting their lending or their financing patterns towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. And what we discovered, which is not a secret, is that in 2021, the last full year for which information was available when we began our report, there was $742 billion worth of finance for fossil fuels being undertaken in that year alone for existing and new projects. But the proportion of funding going into renewable energies is rising, and it's rising exponentially, which is great. And there have been many announcements around COP this last few days, COP28, referring to significant investments in renewables in many countries and by many institutions and supported by many governments, and that's very welcome. But at the moment, the last full year that we've had information for, the ratio of investment in renewable energy systems to fossil fuel systems is 0.9 to 1. So in other words, there is less money being invested in renewables right now than there continues to be in fossil fuels each year. And our report argues that that needs to quadruple. The investment in renewable energy needs to quadruple by 2030 in order to achieve the net zero targets. And that means that financial institutions have got to reorientate themselves away from fossil fuel support to renewables, and many of them are doing so. The question is the pace at which they're doing so, and can they have confidence that they can deploy their resources at the pace and within the viable projects at scale. So our second conclusion from looking at this, the role that the UK can play in trying to lead this effort, was that we described ourselves as being ahead of the peloton. So if you think of a cycle race, the following pack to the leader are called the peloton, and the leader is quite often some way in front. The UK has been some way in front, but we think the peloton is catching up, and we're at risk of becoming just part of the leading group. I'm sure we will remain in the leading group, and one of the reasons we point to in our report is that we are fearful that the UK has been sending some mixed signals about what we're trying to achieve. I think much of that is in the interpretation of speeches by politicians rather than the actual doing, but we will see. We might get into a discussion about that shortly. But certainly within the audiences that we were talking to of these major, as I say, around 40 financial institutions, there was the perception that the balance between energy security and net zero was changing somewhat, and as a result, which stems from the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Energy security became the top issue as energy costs rose dramatically around the world, and therefore the focus was for a period of time on stabilizing energy supply rather than continuing to press ahead for net zero first. So I think that was the rationale behind it, and we've got to move beyond that. Now that energy prices are beginning to revert towards a lower level, I think we have to raise the sights of our politicians and our financial institutions to look towards the big prize, which is solving climate change and the push towards net zero. So I would say that those are the two sort of main thrusts of our inquiry. And what I'd like to do now is to invite Barry Gardner to say a few words in particular on the reporting requirements that we were referring to, which I touched on, the disclosure requirements which the UK has introduced, and then I'm going to ask Claudia to speak for a few moments on the types of investment that are being undertaken in net zero. Barry.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Melanie, for this opportunity to share with everybody our plan. Look, this is all about capital allocation. At the end of it all, the only way we're going to get a just transition, is if we shift capital allocation. And Philip was right. The evidence that our committee took was really quite stark, because what we found was that in just the 6 years from 2016, 60 of the largest private banks had financed $4.6 trillion in fossil fuels. That's after the Paris Agreement, $4.6 trillion. That's 10% more in those 5.5, 6 years than had been invested in renewables in the previous 17 years, right up to now. So you can see the scale of the problem that we have to turn round. Now, if you look at what the International Energy Agency told our committee, they made it very clear that the decline in fossil fuel demand is so steep that there is no need for new long lead time upstream oil and gas conventional projects, and no need for new coal mines or mine extensions. And this is the IEA talking. This is not just some small report. This is the International Energy Agency, who have made that abundantly clear. And that, of course, sends a huge signal to investors about how they need to shift their capital allocation. But over the past decade, the global financial markets have seen 2,300 coal, oil and gas IPOs, initial public offerings, that have raised $600 billion. And in contrast, renewable energy IPOs have raised not even a tenth of that, $56 billion during the same period. So you can see when Philip says, we were very clear that we need to completely do a gear change in the way in which these investments, these capital allocations are focused. And that gear change is in about the ratio of 4 to 1. So at the moment, it's 90 cents going to low carbon energy sources for every dollar that's put towards fossil fuels. And it was not only GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but also Mark Carney that stressed to the committee that needed to quadruple by 2030. So Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative requires policies to phase out fossil fuel investments. That's what the GFANZ is all about. It's about how those asset managers shift that capital allocation. But capital allocation has 3 purposes. It has to drive transition in the real economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's got to enable an orderly and robust transition to build long-term energy security. And it's got to support a just transition. If it's not a just transition, it won't happen. Here we are. We're in the parliamentarians' pavilion. We know this is our constituents we're talking about. We can't do something that's going to put their livelihoods at risk and put them out of jobs. That's why the importance of making sure that capital allocation doesn't simply go to shiny new projects of solar and wind arrays and geothermal and all the rest of it. If it's actually going to put people out of jobs, it won't happen. We've got to take the public with us. And, it was great when HSBC, one of the biggest banks in the world, I don't know if it's the biggest, but it's certainly one of the biggest, announced that it would stop funding new oil and gas projects. But that only applied to its asset financing. And it's still financing companies that have oil and gas expansion plans as part of the transition process. So when we're looking at financial institutions, it's really important that we drill down and get to the nub of what they're actually doing. Now, we concluded that government needs to do more to support a managed phase-out of fossil fuel investment. And we suggested that a policy could be established under the green finance strategy that our government has to address that problem and to minimize the risk of the cost of decommissioning stranded assets falling substantially on the state. And the reason why it's so important that we understand this whole business of stranded assets is very clear. A recent report that came out from the Grantham Institute suggested that by 2032 there would be between 11 and 14 trillion, I don't misspeak, trillion of stranded fossil fuel assets. Now what does that do? What it does, it signals to the whole financial sector, to the whole of the economy, that this is a bad risk. If you're going to end up with trillions of dollars of stranded assets, then you need to shift your capital allocation. So, delighted to welcome another member of our committee who's just joined us. Good to see you, Anna. I want to just focus on a few things. That we received some suggestions, and I think these are really helpful for other countries as well, about how governments can give clear signals to the market to accelerate investment in renewables. Yesterday I was listening to Jay Collins, the head of Citibank, one of the biggest banks in the world, and he was saying, look, the number of times that we would go to a country and say, give us your projects, and they wouldn't have any to give them. The number of times that he would go to a country and say, look, what we need is clarity. We need your targets. We need to know that you're not going to shift the goalposts. And we came up with a few of our own ideas that would help, I think. Reform to planning laws to enable more renewable energy generation to be put in place. Put the government's target to decarbonise on a statutory footing. Make it a law that this has to be done by a certain time. That gives certainty to markets when you're talking about capital allocation. Investors say, if I know they're going to do it, I can see what my rate of return will be, and that really enables funding flows to come through. You've also got to take, as I said earlier, we've got to take our constituents with us. We've got to actually make sure that there is household support for energy saving measures, for energy efficiency in the home. And we need to set targets for renewable energy generation and develop investment models for emerging technologies. So these were all part of the recommendations that are there in the report. I really do urge you to have a look at it and to see not all of it will fit your country's situation. But there's a lot in it that I'm sure you can take away and apply in your own context. So the notion of energy security should increasingly shift towards renewable energy. This is the message, I suppose, that report from the Grantham Institute about stranded assets is telling us. If you want energy security in your country, it doesn't come from the old-fashioned fossil fuel assets. It comes from moving increasingly at pace to renewables, because the truth is that renewables are now cheaper than those old fossil fuel power generation. So, Philip wanted me to talk a little bit, Philip, about the way in which we can influence the reporting requirements. Yeah, and look, governments have a huge role to play in setting the rules for how companies report. And we turned our attention to this, and we said we welcomed our government's intention to consult on requiring companies to disclose their transition plans. But that has to be more than just comply, make that disclosure, or explain why you haven't. And if you can simply say, well, actually, we don't have a transition plan, that's not going to get us anywhere. You really do need to see a move to mandatory reporting of companies' transition plans about the way in which they are aiming to make their enterprise, right the way down the supply chain, net zero. And those who publish transition plans should follow a compulsory framework. Because otherwise what happens is one person will report in one methodology, another company will report in another methodology, and you end up comparing apples and pears, and you don't know which company is actually doing better. So it's really important that you have that stability of reporting framework so that when you're making an assessment of a company's transition plan, whether they really are walking the talk and getting to net zero as they claim, you can say, well, actually, you may be doing that, but you're not doing as well as these people. And you know you can say that because it's that common reporting framework. So, look, a plan is only effective if it delivers its contents. And we think that the government should set simple, consistent regulatory expectations for net zero transition plans and establish an independent mechanism for monitoring and evaluating, checking whether they're doing what they say they're doing. Because just as you have that stability of framework with a common mandatory framework, so you need a consistency in the monitoring of it. So these are ways in which government really can drive this agenda forward. And we also looked at sustainability disclosure requirements. Again, we welcomed our government's intention to incorporate international sustainability standards, board standards, and make them mandatory. Its consultation on reporting Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and its intention to adopt a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So we're not just talking about climate-related financial disclosures, but nature-related financial disclosures as well. You know, over the past 5 or 10 years, so many of us have come to understand that this isn't one crisis. It's not the climate crisis. It's the climate and biodiversity crisis. It's everything coming together. A change in temperature wouldn't matter if it didn't mean that all the ecosystems that our biodiversity encapsulates were crumbling around us, and that they're no longer able to sustain human life. So we think that sense of sustainability disclosures is really, really important. And we said that the government should seek to introduce the UK green taxonomy as soon as possible. That taxonomy should include a spectrum of definitions. During the period of voluntary reporting against the green taxonomy, the government should monitor and report quarterly on progress. Let's get governments doing some real reporting to us as parliaments, as parliamentarians on this matter. And that would optimize the implementation and ensure it becomes mandatory no less than 2 years after the beginning of what is the voluntary period in our country. So let's get this transition rapidly underway, is what we were saying. And I hope, as I say, not all of the things that we've said in the report will relate to your countries. You have a different context, you have a different legislative framework. But I'm sure there's lots in there that you'll be able to dig out and say, hey, yeah, let's copy the good ideas. Let's avoid the mistakes that the UK have made. And we've alluded to some of those as well, haven't we, Philip? But I really hope that it's a report that you can take away and you can fill it for what is really useful to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Barry. One of the beauties about our committee is its diversity. not just in terms of its people, but in terms of us as political parties as well and who we represent. My name is Claudia Webb, and I am the Member of Parliament for Leicester East and an active member on the Environmental Audit Committee, and I'm very pleased to be there. So good morning, and I'm pleased obviously to speak to you as a member of the EAC at the launch of this report, an expression of our recommendations and what we see going forward in this agenda. Our report urges the UK government to go further and faster than it has so far, without a doubt. First and foremost, the report, I believe, pushes the government to do more to meet its promise of net zero by 2050. But we know from climate scientists and what they've told us that the global carbon emissions budget, the amount that we can generate to even have a 50% chance of keeping to 1.5 warming or less, will be used up in just 6 years at current output. In other words, from my perspective, 2050 is far too late, and even if the UK government keeps its promise, a long shot, I believe, we will have missed our opportunity. I think, second, it is clear that even if governments do everything else right that they possibly could, the markets will never resolve this crisis on their own. Market mechanisms to achieve net zero targets won't be enough. Won't be enough to rid us of fossil fuels by 2050 or indeed anytime soon. The City of London, as Philip has indicated, has been the top-rated green finance centre for 4 years running. From where I sit, however, in Leicester, and I look at the square mile of the City of London, it sits for me as one of the top 4 for investments in fossil fuels. The global finance system is unfit for the challenge. We cannot simply harness the market when direct government control and intervention is required. The markets will not stop investing in fossil fuels unless they are made to do so. And I believe that our report makes that clear. Companies will not stop profiting from fossil fuels unless they are made to do so. We cannot accept greenwashing or allow investors and companies to fiddle whilst the world burns. So relying on investor behaviour will not lead to fast enough action on climate. Our report therefore highlights that global fossil fuel financing are in their hundreds of billions and trillions, outpacing significantly investment in renewals. And even if companies did switch entirely to renewable alternatives, the profit motive is unsuitable and inefficient for a world-threatening emergency. And some might say that I would say that because I'm a socialist. And yes, I don't believe that the market can deliver. Finally, our Environment Audit Committee report acknowledges that the government's plans have in significant parts no substance or precision on achieving a just transition. There appears to be no urgency by government to implement mandatory transition plans, leaving almost everything to corporate boards to decide. So you've heard of the saying, comply or report. In other words, if you simply report that you haven't got any green finance plans, that is fine and good enough, according to the direction the government would be going if it doesn't take on board the recommendations that we are making in our report. The UK saw in the death of its coal industry how thriving communities become wastelands if there is no just transition. Moving to net zero without one will decimate even more of the UK and have even more horrific impacts on the developing world. So I'm not going to speak much longer because I think we need to leave room for questions and debate. But so for the sake of brevity and the need to move on to the discussion, I will end there. But the points I've mentioned, I believe, are far from exhaustive. The world needs their governments and us as politicians to think more radically and act faster. And there is nowhere near enough, in my view, of that happening, and no sign of that at the moment. We need to act faster. The world can't wait. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Philip. And it's now a moment to turn to yourselves for the discussion to take place. I would like to use Chair's prerogatives to get the discussion started, if I may. I have so many questions. It's such a dense report. It's such a timely report, of course. And so many of the issues that you touched on are going to be covered in other dialogue platforms here at COP. Of course, it's the energy, the industry, and the Just Transition Day. So if I may just start with a couple. So beginning with the emphasis that you laid, Claudia, on finance for net zero transition planning. My question to you is the focus of the report very much on the corporate sector? Or are you also looking at other stakeholders who have to deliver? I'm thinking particularly of local authorities. So shortly after this session, we're going to be having a focus with Chris Skidmore on net zero and local authorities. So local authorities have exactly those same needs for green finance plans, which have to be backed up. Green transition plans which have to be backed up by finance. So what's your message on that? I'm just going to bundle the initial questions just in three. So that's really going from the bottom to the top. The next point is the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act was a high watermark. It was a gold standard for climate change frameworks. Earlier this morning, we had an absolutely such a fantastic, stimulating, comprehensive presentation by a leading parliamentarian, Cedric Froelich, from South Africa, in which he was talking about how the UK's Climate Change Act informs the about to be hopefully adopted Climate Change Act in South Africa, which would then make the number of climate change acts in Africa, the continent, to fall imminently. But he also emphasized so many points that you have made in yours, which is, first of all, the need to triple renewal investment by the end of the decade, to double energy efficiency, but the crashingly low number of projects which are coming to market, the point that you had made, Philip. So how can that be accelerated? And specifically, one of the things that actually we didn't get time to discuss, but very much in the context of the UK's own partnerships, is the JETPs. The other partnership which was launched at Glasgow, in addition to GFANS, was this other acronym, the JETP partnership, the Just Energy Transition Partnership with 5 countries, of which South Africa was the first. So where is the role? Did you cover that? Of course, that's a bilateral level, but did you cover that at all? And finally, the role of the Climate Change Committee in all of this. Because you talked about the need for reporting standards, monitoring, third-party verification. What is the role there of the Climate Change Committee?
Start off, if I may. Thank you very much for responding so positively to our report. And I'd just like to mention, because they haven't been mentioned, that Matthew Offord, who's a member of our committee, is here in the audience. Anna Morin, as Barry mentioned, just arrived, is another member of our committee, and particularly Chris Laws, who's arrived from the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee, which Barry also sits on. So it's good to see you all here. So picking up your questions on local authorities, yes, we did touch on the role local authorities have to play on delivery in the UK, because it is through local authorities that much of the sort of retail elements of net zero need to be played out. So in the UK, which is a a country where we have a housing stock that is relatively old compared to many other countries, which is almost totally uninsulated compared to other countries in Northern Europe. And there's a lot of work needs to be done there. It accounts for about 18% of our emissions, our housing stock. So that a lot of that improvement work needs to be directed through local authorities. And we've made some recommendations as to how the government should do that. They're relatively sort of discreet to the UK because they relate to the way in which the government distributes money from the centre down to the local authorities. There's somewhat less application elsewhere. Your comment about the Climate Change Committee, they give evidence to our committee regularly. They're obviously the advisor to the government, so we interrogate some of their advice where we don't necessarily agree with it. Generally speaking, we do.
They're an advisor to Parliament. That's really important.
I'm sorry, they're an advisor to Parliament, so they appear before our committee, but the government tends to rely heavily on their advice, as do we, but we can also challenge them where we think they're perhaps not focusing on things that they should be, and energy efficiency of buildings is one where actually I think they were a bit behind the curve. I know Barry has got to slip off. Did you want to respond to anything else?
Apologies that I do have to go to another meeting, but it's actually relevant to what you were asking, Melanie, because you're right. Cedric this morning spoke about the influence that the 2008 Climate Change Act passed with all-party consensus. I think there might have been 5 or at most 6 members of the Parliament out of 650 who did not support it in those days. So it's really important to get that cross-party consensus. And it's had a huge influence in getting other enabling legislation around the world. Very interestingly, there is now happening in Africa, and I can't remember which country it is, and I don't want to put them on the spot, but there's new legislation that's just been passed by an African country, which is now having statutory obligations on each department of government to make the same commitments about carbon budgets and having its budget approved in line with its net zero commitment. Now, I think that is a really interesting move forward from the UK model in 2008, what South Africa's trying to do. And I think if we could see that sort of structure where in most governments there will be a person in the finance department, in the treasury, who is responsible for the allocation of financial resources. And they will have meetings each month with different departments and say, yes, you can pursue that policy. No, you can't pursue that policy. We'll give you so much money, we won't give you the rest of what you want. What we need is we actually need a similar person operating for natural capital who is able in each department to have that power of allocation and to do that in line with what this country is now doing to control the budget of that responsibility to ensure that's in line with net zero, I think could be really transformative. And here's something where I think we had a good idea. It went to Africa. It was taken up in Africa. It's now been improved in Africa, and we need to learn from that. But I apologize, I must go. But the reason I'm going is because I'm going to meet with the GCF, the Global Climate Fund, who have actually been working with us to develop a capacity building project with legislators in different countries in Africa and ultimately in South Asia as well. And that capacity building is to enable parliamentarians to understand how best they can remove the blockages to get the capital allocations, to get the funding flows going through to real projects in their country. So I hope on that basis you'll forgive me if I leave slightly early.
Indeed, I wish you good luck with that. Thank you so much.
You did ask about whether we were looking at international aspects, and we only really were looking at international elements of this to the extent to which they're financial institutions that are operating out of the UK, but the reporting requirements that Barry was talking about do apply to their entire book. So we're having some influence in requiring companies that are listed in the UK or are regulated in the UK to start to report on both their climate impact, net zero impact, and their nature impact, which is coming. And I think just to pick up on what was being said about nature, we've now got at COP26, the Office of National Statistics agreed with the government that they would start to provide quarterly reporting on nature impact of our economy, which is a world first. That's yet to sort of get fully adopted, but is coming quite quickly. And I think that, in parallel with requirements for nature impact reporting on financial institutions, will start to drive behaviours to improve nature, and for all companies to understand the impact that their activities are having on nature depletion and try to reverse it.
Thank you so much.
Well, I don't want to really add much more to what's been said, except on the issue of local authorities is one of the questions you asked. I mean, I think, and also on how we deliver in cooperation. I think the reality is, from my perspective, we need leadership to be in place in order for there to be a consistent approach, even across local authorities and across regions, and so that there isn't an imbalance of London versus elsewhere, but that when that leadership comes through, that there is significant investment at that local level with the key skill and levels within local authorities, and therefore this requires investment. We need to reinvest back that which local authorities had, which was significant departments that looked at these issues. Those departments don't exist. So in order to move the agenda forward, it's almost as though expertise within has to start from zero. And also the grant approach, and I think this came up in our committee, the grant approach to local authorities, in competitive granting, it's a carrot and stick. It's not what is needed. What is needed is investment when the need is. And so there is no point having, a simple analysis, having progress in London around 15-minute cities, when in an area like mine, literally we can't walk the pavement, because in order to solve the car problem, we decide to halve the pavement in order to allow cars to park on the pavement, instead of doing what is needed, which is to challenge the way our cities are run and operate, and become, we have less carbon emission through use of cars and more 15-minute cities, because in a sense we cave in to pressure, and therefore local authorities, regional authorities shouldn't be competing for these resources. Governments need to invest, and that can't rely on the markets, as I've been indicating. Thank you.
And about 3 years ago, we issued a report on a new finance facility for London, which would be able to leverage London's role as the number one in terms of green finance and capital finance to benefit Londoners themselves. Just to pick up on something that Barry had mentioned, he was trying to remember the country in Africa which had actually mandated that at the government departmental level, that departments also have the requirements to insist on allocation, adequate fiscal allocation to match departmental net zero objectives. And actually the country was Nigeria. And the person who actually worked on that is in the room. And my colleague, Nameka Oru, from Globe Nigeria. So we've been very close to this agenda, but it just shows the power of international cooperation and diffusion, that from the UK's 2008 Act, that very significant number of measures were adopted. In fact, the whole framework was adopted with carbon budgets, etc., in other parts of the world. And they're coming back to the UK now with recommendations on how, through post-legislative scrutiny, perhaps the 2008 Act itself may pick up on innovations from elsewhere. So I know that there are a number of members, other members of the Environment Audit Committee and other select committees here in the room, if you'd like to contribute your thoughts in the last few minutes of the discussion here. And there are also other members of Parliament here if you'd like to just, there's a microphone for you. Please do introduce yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kamau Munyoro. I'm a member of Parliament in the Kenyan Parliament. I think first is you've done a very good job of what we've had, and I've listened. And I come from a country where we are very serious on the issue of clean energy. But one of my concerns is what I've heard, and Honorable here had said about banks not buying in. They're still financing a lot of fossil fuel companies. And my question would be whether we are involving them very well, because we might face a crisis when that time comes and they are caught flat-footed. And you know, globally, if banks are not with us, and I'm talking about now the IEA, everybody who knows that this is a direction we are going, we might have a crisis in terms of a financial crisis. And secondly is about Nigeria. I know about that case, and it's done very well. Our president also has been very consistent on his mandate in terms of this net zero effect, maybe by 2030. And I know in our parliament we are working very closely with the executive to work on that. So my contribution is probably we need to involve more people. We need to involve local authorities, like you've said. We need to involve our constituents, but more importantly, the financial institutions. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. I'm actually in the Finance Committee, and I was here with the minister. He was actually presenting in one of the rooms. We've worked hard and hard with Treasury, the central bank, so that when the time comes for that policy that needs to involve when you're getting your finances, you need to have met certain criteria, they will be on board. So we are working together as a team. Thank you.
For your concluding remarks, thank you. And response.
Thank you. So just to pick up on how do we persuade banks to adjust their lending portfolios? Well, we're doing it in the UK from this requirement to disclose. So we take the position that if the regulator requires banks to reveal the extent to which their lending policies are towards, in simplistic terms, fossil fuels or renewables, it's not quite that simple, but that will encourage them to, the transparency allows stakeholders who have an influence over banks, so their shareholders, their employees, their customers, to decide whether they want to work with that institution or not. And that pressure becomes consuming, so that the board of the bank starts to ask questions of the executives: why are you investing such a large proportion still in these fossil fuel projects? And over time, the policies change and it comes in line with what's required. And by making those disclosure requirements increasingly stringent and mandatory, you'd start to influence behavior really quite quickly. It sounds as though it's a very slow iterative process, but as banks compete with each other to do the right thing as well as to make the most money, they have a profit motive, this transition will come about, and we're already seeing that. It's a question of pace and finding the suitable projects, as was mentioned earlier, to invest in. In some countries, they're more advanced in the number of projects. They've got the natural resource to be able to use. I think of Morocco as a good example, which is doing a great deal of work in both solar and wind, and looking at interconnect. They have an interconnector into Spain. They're looking at an interconnector into the UK, of all places. That's a 2,500 mile interconnector. This is very high up their political agenda. They have a different political system than we do, but similar things are happening. And the banks want to fund these projects because their clients, the pension funds and the insurance companies, are looking for very long-term, stable returns, which are, the sun is a more stable return than a declining oil reserve in the under the land or under the ocean. So I think this is going to happen. It's just going to, and regulators can start to influence that change. And so I'd just like to conclude, before I hand over to Claudia, to thank thank Globe, first of all, for making this platform available. It is unusual for the House of Commons to be able to launch one of our reports on an international stage. We really appreciate the opportunity and hope we'll be able to do so again at a future COP.
Thank you. I don't really want to add more to this, except to say that I think what we heard from ministers when we did our inquiry was some intentions, some what I would call research, a roadmap towards. And I think my frustration is that this is not fast enough. It is not moving enough. And the ideas are there, but the implementation is not there. And whether or not it will happen before even the end of the current Parliament term is not clear. And yet we are in an emergency. And so it is, the UK could, if it wanted to, lead this agenda towards, net zero finance. But if it's in the processes of those research and those roadmaps, and it constantly stays there, then we're not going to make the ambitions and the changes that we need in terms of holding the banks to account and tracking what they do, make that a reality. And yes, banks obviously can do more, but who's holding them to account, and what is it that's holding them to account? And the government has the power to regulate and enforce, if nothing else, but it also has the power to invest. And I think that we need to obviously do more to invest, to make those changes. I just wanted to say, yesterday I met the organization which I'd long forgotten about, but actually we should remember that it exists, which in my days used to be called CDC, but is now BII. And I think I don't believe we had them at our inquiry, but they are doing work in terms of British investments overseas, which I think is valuable and that we should know more about. And maybe our government isn't speaking loudly enough about what it is doing in terms of investing in that organization. It's not a grant, it's an investment for a return that does good work, from what I can see. And I think we probably need to champion that a bit more. But I'm really delighted that we are here at Globe presenting our report. It's one step towards leading the agenda. And I hope that we can influence the leadership of our respective parties in the UK to come on board with where we are as parliamentarians and where Globe is in the challenge it's setting at all levels. Thank you.
Warm words. Globe is here as the focal point for the International Parliamentary Constituency at the UN. So in this wonderful pavilion, the Parliamentary Pavilion, the first time, of course, we welcome a whole host of other parliamentary networks, including Climate Parliament, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, the Climate Vulnerable Forum Parliament, etc., etc. And of course, we are trying to deliver on the COP presidency's commitment itself. You'll know that their slogan is Unite, Act and Deliver, and that is very much what we seek to do. We also wish to bring before you some of those who have remained hidden in the constellation of financial actors. And Claudio very rightly mentioned an organization that used to be called the Combos Development Cooperation Fund. So there's been a lot of identity change, but the missions are still there. And so collectively, we hope that we can bring before you, the committee, in your perhaps review in the coming months of the response to the reports on the role of the financial sector and the UK's net zero transition, some other players to inform the delivery. But at this moment, I would very much like to thank you all for your patience, for your contributions, and above all, good luck. Good luck with the next stage, the implementation of the recommendations of your report. Thank you all so very much, and good afternoon.